Welcome back to another episode of Swamp Stories. For this episode, we head back to LA, and not an area you would ever expect. But before we get into it, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you're new. You can also follow the Instagram page as well. So let's get into it. When people think of LA, there are dozens of areas that come to mind. Hollywood, Westwood, South Central, Calabasas, Compton, Long Beach, and plenty more. But an area that you never hear about is San Pedro. It's so random that people in LA like Adam22 don't even know how to pronounce it. So let me break it down. San Pedro is a small neighborhood all the way at the bottom of the map. And although it's technically part of Los Angeles, it's really its own world. That's because it's pretty much disconnected from the rest of the city. You have to cross 2 bridges to get to Long Beach, and you have to drive through a giant oil refinery to get to the rest of LA. So San Pedro is like an island that everyone forgets about. The majority of the area is quiet and residential, except for one small portion. But in order for it to make sense, let's head back to the 1940s. During the wartime, the US needed workers to build ships to send overseas. So they established Terminal Islands as the shipyards, which is located right next to San Pedro. But they had a major problem. San Pedro was a middle to upper class neighborhood, and many of the residents were not going to work on the shipyards. So the federal government decided to demolish an entire neighborhood of houses in order to build something called Rancho San Pedro. The giant housing project consists of 479 units, and in 1942 it began being filled up by temporary workers from Louisiana and Mississippi. But unfortunately for them, the shipyards were shut down in 1943, just a year after they had arrived. And eventually the shipyards would be transformed into the Port of Los Angeles, but that wouldn't be for a while. So many of these workers became unemployed, and in order to accommodate their needs, the government turned over Rancho San Pedro to the LA Housing Authority. Over the next couple of decades, some residents moved to South Central and others went back home to the South, and this left many vacant units that others would gladly take. So over time, many Latino immigrants would move into the projects, and this would create an interesting dynamic. But this wasn't unique to San Pedro because this would occur all over California, from Oakland to Sacramento all the way down to LA. But here's a major difference. Up north, things worked out very nicely. The transition was about as smooth as it could be, and it's been that way ever since. But in LA, it's a whole nother story. So in order to protect themselves, 2 sides would begin to form in Rancho San Pedro. First, let me introduce you to the Dodge City Crips. Formed in 1972, they began claiming the whole west side of San Pedro. At first, it was just a small group of guys, but throughout the 70s, it grew to a few hundred members. And around the same time they formed, so did San Pedro 13, also known as Rancho San Pedro LOCOS. And at first, they were much smaller, but over the years, they grew to be much bigger than Dodge City. And not only did they get bigger, they also gained a crazy reputation. That would be after one of their members made national headlines. But before we get into it, let me run the intro. Let me take you back to the 1980s and introduce you to a teenager named Angelo Regino. He was born and raised in the Rancho San Pedro projects and became a San Pedro 13 in his early teenage years. During the mid-1980s, Angelo started being called the caveman because he was truly a wild teenager. And oddly enough, he had an obsession with the movie Nightmare on Elm Street, and more specifically Freddy Krueger. He was known to re-watch the movie on VHS over and over. And fair enough, some people really like a movie and the feeling they get from it, so who's to judge, right? No, not in this case, because Angelo would take this to an extreme level. He began wearing a scary mask, a fedora hat, and a striped sweatshirt. And not only would he look the part, but he would go on some insane sprees. And it all began on the night of January 7th, 1988. Angelo decides to take the bus all the way up to Santa Monica, looking to do Freddy Krueger types of things. He begins strolling the neighborhood. As he's walking down 18th Street, he finds a man laying down, sleeping in the back of his pickup truck. Bang! After this, Angelo walks down to 17th Street and hides in the bushes. A man named Ruel Cruz walks by and Angelo jumps out of the bushes. He starts yelling that he's Freddy Krueger and wants the man's clothes for some reason. So the man follows his directions and then runs away. And after this, somehow Angelo makes it back to San Pedro without being caught. So the spree is not over. The next day, Angelo goes to a convenience store where he's able to hit for $6,000, but everything would end 3 days later. After going down for everything, Angelo would still be offered a way out. The DA would allow him to point fingers at his friends, but Angelo would keep his mouth shut. And because of this, he will never be getting out. So after this, Angelo the Caveman became an infamous name in San Pedro. It's kind of like a story that no one believes until they look it up for themselves. Because of incidents like this, Rancho San Pedro gained a bad reputation throughout LA. So much so that the mayor began calling for it to be demolished for good. But residents would fight to keep it from being demolished and the plans fell apart. But in retrospect, maybe they would have been better off going through with it, because the 1990s would be a crazy decade in Rancho San Pedro. And before you call me crazy, let me explain. Historically, Dodge City and San Pedro 13 were not rivals. They weren't friends either, but they definitely left each other alone and dealt with their own issues. San Pedro 13 was rivals with Wilmas 13, which is short for the city of Wilmington, located just north of them. And Dodge City was rivals with Waterfront PIRU, which are located in Wilmington as well. So overall, San Pedro and Wilmington were pretty much at odds for the 1980s and early 90s. In fact, the whole harbor area was just as crazy as South Central and Compton during this time. The only difference is that they barely got any media coverage. The Wilmington and San Pedro rivalry was a daily occurrence according to LAPD. They even had to dedicate a whole task force to try to intervene. But all of that would calm down in 1996, and not because of any truce. It happened by default. Let me explain. The legend goes that there was a barbecue in Rancho San Pedro with Dodge City and San Pedro 13. And there, an argument broke out between two guys, and that led to the loss of a Dodge City man. The next day, Dodge City would return the favor, and after this, all relations completely fell apart. Dodge City and San Pedro 13 became instant rivals, and all of their issues with Wilmington had to take a back seat. This became one of the wildest situations that's never talked about. They lived in the same apartments, so they were rivals with their own neighbors. But just when you thought it couldn't possibly get worse than that, it started to not even matter if you were Dodge City or not. And that takes us to January 3rd, 2005. A group of friends in San Pedro decide to host a late New Year's party. None of them are associated or affiliated with Dodge City, except that one of them is childhood friends with Kiko Loke, a Dodge City man who passed away just a year prior. He actually has a tattoo on his left shoulder that says "In loving memory of Kiko Loke." But anyways, the group of friends go to the nearby gas station to get some drinks, and that's where they run into a man named Danny Trejo and his group of friends. They all spark up a friendly conversation, and the guys end up inviting Andy and his friends to their party. But little do they know, these guys are San Pedro 13, but that shouldn't matter to them, or at least you'd think. So fast forward a few hours, everything is going well and the party is packed. A girl approaches the man with a tattoo on his shoulder and asks what it means. So the man rolls up his sleeve and tells her that it commemorates his friend named Kiko Loke. Andy Trejo overhears the conversation and walks up to the man. He says, "I didn't like that fool Kiko," and from there an argument starts. So the men go outside and talk it out. They tell Andy that they're not involved with Dodge City at all. So Andy says fair enough, and both sides shake hands. One of the men named Michael Gutierrez taps Andy Trejo's friend on the shoulder to let him know that everything is good and they aren't Dodge City. But the man, whose name is Hector Garcia, felt disrespected for whatever reason, and he takes it to another level. Bam! Unfortunately, random incidents like this would continue to occur on a regular basis. Just a couple of years later, on October 15th, 2007, a 51-year-old father would lose his life just walking through his wife's neighborhood. The man had nothing to do with Dodge City, but San Pedro 13 wanted to send a message. And eventually, enough was enough, and many people began moving out of Rancho San Pedro for good. San Pedro 13 now control the entire area and peace has been made. Neither side will interact or cross paths, and they will leave everything in the past. But sadly, Dodge City had no choice after everything they had gone through. By the end of 2007, Dodge City had pretty much disappeared for good, both because of San Pedro 13 and because of investigations. Let me explain. Dodge City began making money as, let's say, special delivery drivers. And for whatever reason, they made a strong connection with a small town called ZANESVILLE, Ohio. That's a 33-hour drive, so you best believe it was lucrative for them to be going that far. And you might be wondering what they were delivering, and I'm not gonna say it, but you guys know what Ohio and the rest of Appalachia is known for. So for a few years, Dodge City would alternate about 20 people to go back and forth on these journeys. And along the way, they even added stops in Louisiana and Mississippi. But as their delivery business got bigger and bigger, it started to draw some attention, especially when they began using the postal service. One day, a suspicious package was detected. Somehow they scanned large amounts of cash in a package. How that works, I don't know, but apparently that's a thing that exists. Anyways, so the package was opened and it contained a whole lot of money. So the Zanesville police looked up the shipping address and found it to be the residence of a man named Clarence Remble. This is when investigations began. On July 21st, 2005, 20 Dodge City men would go down for everything, and they had no idea what they were about to go through. Because this involved multiple states, it was handed over to the federal government. And like DJ Vlad always says, you are not winning anything against the federal government. And once again, Officer Vlad would be correct. Clarence Remble would receive a life sentence in 2006. Unfortunately, he left a 5-year-old boy at home. His son is named Unique Remble, and that perfectly describes who he is. Although he was born in San Pedro, Remble mostly grew up in Compton and South Central. He began rapping at the age of 16 and released his debut song, Fortnite, on YouTube. This caught the attention of many people in LA because he was rapping like a college professor while saying some of the hardest lyrics. His style even caught the attention of Blueface, who you can spot in his second song called Bang That. After this, he would freestyle over a Draco the Ruler beat and tag him in the comments. Once Draco saw the video, he DM'd Remble, and from there they were locked in. Remble joined the Stink team, and together him and Draco dropped Ruth Chris Freestyle, which took his career to the next level. But after Draco the Ruler passed away, everything would fall out between Remble and the Stink team. First, the Stink team became upset after Remble failed to attend Draco's funeral. Then secondly, they noticed that he recently followed YG on Instagram. So one of the Stinks would direct message Remble asking why he didn't attend the funeral. And Remble would respond saying that they never sent him the location. Then Remble would claim that the Stink team messed with people who dissed him. And this would prompt some Stink team members to go off on Remble on social media. They would claim that he was never in LA until he met Draco and all kinds of other accusations. Talking on social media is something that can be settled easily, but once you make a diss record, things are taken to a whole new level. The Stink team would drop a Remble diss track over his Untouchable beat, and the lyrics speak for themselves. Check it out.
He can't claim the Stink team, I know he's sick of living. He's a big dog, I'm aiming 7 cannons at his blue nose.
He be in the house, so he feel like he untouchable. Used to slap his music till I found out he was weird as
Who knows if Remble's gonna respond? At this point, he's probably taking the Mozzie industry rapper route, so I guess that he probably won't. And I'm not hating on the industry route, but there's always a cost when you lose touch with the streets. All in all, hopefully this can work itself out because LA does not need any more problems. Enough is enough, and it's always over something pointless in the long run. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. Do you think Remble's wrong for not attending Draco's funeral, or do you think the Stink team is wrong for calling him out? And that's gonna do it for this episode of Swamp Stories. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you're new. Peace!